I'd like to preface this video with a few things. First, thanks to the folks from r/Swain mains who helped me with this video, whether it be research or any information about Swain I didn't have prior to making this. Without your help, this video wouldn't have been possible. Second, this video is not about mindlessly bashing this champion. It's meant to be insightful to those who may not know what's going on with this champion, as well as talk about potential changes to make him viable in the solo lane again, and why he's currently stuck as a support. Which brings me to my third point. This video is about solo lane Swain. I understand that as of the date this video was posted, he works fine as a support, but that isn't what this video is about. This video will also assume you have knowledge of current Swain's ability set. With that out of the way, let's get to the video. Before I talk about Swain's current state, I'm going to quickly go over a bit of the history of changes made to this champion. On February 7th, 2018, Swain's rework was released with less than stellar impressions. His Q didn't pierce through minions unless it killed them, making wave clear awkward, even more so when you combine it with its somewhat high early game cooldown, and how minions got in the way when trying to hit champions in lane with it. His W was smaller than it is now, and his E was thinner. Demon Flare, his second part of his ultimate, didn't pass through champions, meaning any tanks in Swain's way could block damage for the team without any blocking ability like Yasuo's Windwall or Braum's E. But over time, Swain slowly got the buffs he needed. The cooldown on his Q got buffed, his W got bigger, his E got a little fatter, and his ult saw healing buffs, along with the damage of Demon Flare finally passing through enemy champions. Eventually, Swain was becoming a viable solo laner again, finding a decent place in the meta, and even becoming a popular pick in pro play for some time in 2018. But Swain main still needed more. His Q still didn't pierce through minions, which made his extremely weak early game a chore to get through. His E was still awkward to land, and his ult's healing threshold and soul requirement were somewhat problematic in letting Swain be the battle mage he needed to be in teamfights if he wasn't snowballing. Swain mains wanted changes that would allow Swain to keep this early game weakness, but mitigate it through mid game to become a monster late game. Eventually, Riot listened. Sort of. On July 17th, 2019, on patch 9.14, Swain got a gameplay update. His passive, Q, and ultimate saw the most drastic changes of anything in his kit. Swain's new passive now gave him mana and permanent max health upon collecting a soul fragment, as well as keeping the heal for each fragment collected. Along with the removal on the soul limit and the minimum 1 soul requirement to cast his ult, this meant that Swain now had to rely on collecting souls to get mana back in exchange for souls now granting permanent max health. His Q was finally given the ability to pierce through minions, stopping at the first champion hit. The caveats were that the angle between all the bolts changed, making it harder for Swain to land all 5 on an enemy champion from a safer range, and a nerf to the cooldown, increasing it from 7 seconds at level 1 to 10 seconds. Swain mains were now forced to go all in if they wanted to land all 5 bolts, and the cooldown nerf meant that Swain's wave clear was still kept weak early game. His ultimate, Demonic Ascension, was given a mana cost and had the health threshold for Demon Flare, the second part, removed, but was ultimately nerfed. The health gain upon casting the ult was lowered in exchange for doubling the health gain from souls temporarily, as well as Demon Flare seeing damage nerfs across the board, with its scaling damage now being tied to the amount of healing done over the duration of the ult, with a cap now set in place to 400 plus 100% of his AP at max rank. So why does this matter so much? Well, it's because Swain is still fundamentally flawed in design, but Riot was so close to getting him right. Let's talk about these design flaws and what this patch did that single-handedly killed Swain as a solo laner. If you can, just for a few minutes, I'd like you to humor me with a thought here. I want you to think of every champion that typically goes top or mid, and I want you to think of a champion that you can teach someone to counter within the span of 5 minutes. Think of someone who, regardless of the skill level of your student, can be countered through mere minutes of explanation. Did you come up with anyone? If so, feel free to let me know in the comments. But if you didn't come up with one, I'll give you one. The Birdman himself. Swain's ability as a battle mage in the laning phase leaves a lot to be desired. He's got high cooldowns, he's slow and lacks a mobility spell, and is pretty mana reliant. However, Swain does have a solid all-in combo with EW pull Q. His E does damage twice and roots, giving Swain the opportunity to land his other abilities and start a fight strong. His W has good base damage and a slow, forcing the opponent to stick onto Swain when the root is finished and giving Swain a soul fragment to heal from. The pull also gave Swain a soul fragment and put the enemy in a better position for Swain to get close and land a 5-bolt Q for huge damage. If he were level 6 and getting ganked, his ult gave him enough health and healing to tank it, with Demon Flare being the finishing touch to a devastating all-in from Swain. There is one major flaw to this routine, however. Swain needs to land the E first. Now you may be thinking, just land the E like any other skill shot, and normally you'd be right. The way Never Move works, however, is fundamentally flawed in design and poses a crutch to Swain depending on the matchup and the state of the lane. There are two important things to remember here about Swain's E. It only roots the first enemy unit it hits on the way back, and it will always return to Swain's current position. So here's where the problem lies with his E. In order to get a root as fast as possible, Swain needs to land it at max range. This means that Swain is forced to stay at a particular range in order to land the root as easily as possible. The issue lies in how easy Swain's E is to interact with. The initial cast is not very fast, it gives him no movement speed buff or slow, and the moment it's cast, the player only has to worry about one thing, and that's dodging the return. And what are your options here? Simple, anywhere but in a straight line towards Swain. Think about it. Swain has to land this ability at max range, so even if you move backwards away from him, it won't reach you. If you move left or right, it won't reach you either, unless the Swain player is smart and decides to position himself in a way where the return will go in a different direction, which is where part 2 of the problem lies: positioning. Swain is slow and has no mobility spell, so the only way for him to get around is by walking. Knowing this, as long as the opponent doesn't walk in the same direction towards Swain while his E is out, and as long as they aren't walking in a straight line towards him, this ability suddenly becomes a lot harder to land. Now, of course, you may be thinking that skill shots are just a part of League of Legends and that it's up to the player to land successfully, and you'd be right. But where does Swain have proper control of this? At any range other than max, Swain gives the opponent even more time to react to the hand returning, and at max range, it becomes predictable and gives the opponent room to dodge. Swain's E can basically be disrespected by anyone who knows the 2 points I mentioned earlier, making Swain a lot harder to play in lane. He won't have the opportunity to initiate on his own terms and land the Q up close for damage, and his W can be walked out of on reaction. None of Swain's other abilities can compensate for him missing his E, and they don't help him land it either. The single interaction with the ability already puts Swain at a massive disadvantage, and what I just explained to you is basically a universal way of countering Swain before you even worry about your build or champion specifics. In short, dodging the E is just one of many ways to beat Swain, but is ultimately the most important part. This isn't to say that I think Swain's E should be easy to land, but it needs to change in order to be more effective at higher elos. Many have suggested that they allow Swain to manually toggle its return. This change should help him in top lane without shifting his power in mid, but the only reason I would disagree with this change is because this would make his E unreactable, and top laners would have absolutely no way to deal with this ability if Swain could just cast it and recall it immediately. But this is merely scratching the surface, so let's talk about his other toolkit issues before we move on to his build and lane specific issues. Swain's Q is going to be the next topic of discussion here, and is probably the next ability that Swain mains are upset with the most, and for good reason. Before patch 9.14, Swain's Q was a single change away from being perfect. All it needed was the ability to pierce minions for better wave clear. Unfortunately, Riot was holding the monkey's paw when they finally gave it to him, because Swain's Q lost what made it such a potent threat: its relatively low cooldown and the angle between the bolts. Swain used to be able to land his full combo at a safer distance, since the pre-patch angle allowed Swain to hit all 5 bolts even if he wasn't hugging his opponent. With the new angle, Swain has no choice but to put himself in a dangerous spot to get the full damage on the Q. This is fine against mages and assassins in the mid lane, since their squishiness allows Swain to initiate and gain a significant life lead off the combo, but it significantly lowers his viability in top because the champs that you see in that lane are usually bruisers or tanks. As of the date this video was posted, Garen, Wukong, and Darius are some of the champs that currently dominate the top lane meta. Without his ult, Swain doesn't actually prefer his fights to last long. His E and his W have longer cooldowns because they're the first 2 things Swain needs in order to ensure a successful trade or engage, and his Q is meant to be the damage he needs to actually finish them off once he's up close. However, because of the cooldown nerf, this isn't really possible. Swain's Q isn't up as often anymore, meaning he'll rely on his initial burst to win trades or fights altogether, but this burst simply isn't effective enough in the top lane. Once Swain's combo is finished and both the root and slow are done, Swain is basically a sitting duck. Champs like Jax, Darius, and Wukong are basically given a turn to get a full combo off themselves, and Swain can't do anything about it. Don't get it twisted though, I'm not saying Swain should be able to spam his Q, because it still does a great deal of damage. But why would they make it harder to get that damage and available less often? A revert to either the angle or the cooldown would work, since the cooldown revert would mean they keep the Q weak as a ranged poke in exchange for consistent damage after initiating his combo. But an angle revert would let Swain keep up in trades with beefy top laners while still keeping him in check in mid, since his initial burst is usually enough to put him at a significant advantage. And the worst part? I haven't told you how much damage it does at level 1. I've only been speaking about this damage for mid game or late game. At level 1, Q can only do between 55 and 88 damage. Think about that. 88 damage on a 10-second spell that is meant to be used in melee range. Fixing this is as easy as changing the damage ratio for additional bolts to 35% at all ranks, which would at least change the max damage at level 1 from 88 to 132. His passive is also extremely underwhelming, since the new health stacks from souls don't add up to a lot. To give you an idea of how little impact this has to Swain's stats, you would need to land an EW combo 15 times to gain an additional 150 health. This sounds nice when paired with his ult, since it doubles his bonus health from souls temporarily, but in any other instance it just isn't helpful, especially when you factor in how difficult it is to land E on an opponent who knows about its flaws like I mentioned earlier. The mana regen on it should also be given back to his Q in order to give him an easier time CSing. Finally, let's talk about his ult. Before patch 9.14, Swain's ult allowed him to sustain in teamfights and reward him with a massive burst of damage the longer the teamfight went on. Post-patch, Swain now has to make a choice that doesn't yield nearly the same rewards, whether you choose to use it for sustain or damage. Swain's ult would work like this. You would use the ult to get tanky, since it gave a significant health boost and a bunch of healing. After meeting the healing threshold, you could pop Demon Flare, and the damage used to scale based on the amount of souls you had. The cap used to be 5 souls, so if you had 5 souls as you popped your ult, you would get max damage as soon as Demon Flare is allowed to be cast. This gave Swain a choice. Keep your ult up for sustain and hope you can use Demon Flare later to clutch victory for your team, or pop the Demon Flare right away to give your team the life lead in exchange for your survivability. Now, the ult doesn't reward either side as much. The soul requirement to cast the ult is gone, and the healing threshold to cast Demon Flare is gone, which is great, but the scaling damage is now tied to the amount of healing done during the ult. So here's where the problem lies. Why would Swain ever pop Demon Flare early? Its damage is tied to the healing, so Swain has to sit in a team fight for a few seconds before he can optimize Demon Flare. But by the time Swain would want to pop it, the team fight is usually over anyway. The lowered health gain on cost also hurts a bit, especially when they shifted the bulk of it towards the amount of bonus max health Swain has gained through his souls, meaning that his ult becomes significantly worse when he's behind. Demonic Ascension is still fine for sustain, but Demon Flare has been reduced to a snowball favoring ability rather than one that has merit in any situation. Now you may be thinking to yourself, Swain must be able to fix some of the issues in his kit with his build, right? Build Rylai's to stick to targets, Rod of Ages to help get through the early game and strengthen your mid game, etc, etc. But unfortunately, this isn't really the case. Swain's itemization leaves a lot to be desired. Let's talk about it. Here's the bottom line with Swain's itemization. There isn't a single build path that Swain can follow without sacrificing an essential stat. While there are certainly builds that alleviate a lot of problems, all of them have one major flaw that can be abused by the enemy laner, assuming they know what it is. Each of these builds are functional though, so don't get it twisted. They're fine builds that many players make work, but they're still flawed pretty significantly. Currently, there are only a few ways to build Swain. The first and most common is the Rod of Ages route leading into Zhonya's, with Electrocute, Phase Rush, Conqueror, or Grasp being taken as your main rune. This build gives Swain most of what he needs, stacking health, mana, and AP, allowing him to really pop off in the mid game if he doesn't fall behind. Once you get your Zhonya's, you'll have enough stats and utility to really make a difference. The big flaw with this route is that you get no CDR until you get your Zhonya's, leaving you in a position to hope that whoever you're facing in lane doesn't do enough damage during your Q's cooldown to kill you before you can fire off enough Q's to kill them first.
Good luck with that, though.
It's a build that Swain players will use when they're confident in their mid-game skills, and typically what beginners will build as well. The second path involves Lost Chapter items, such as Luden's Echo or Archangel's Staff, with the Electrocute rune, sacrificing sustainability for pure damage. On paper, this seems okay, since Swain's ult should be enough to keep you healthy enough to overpower your enemies, but actually just makes you easier to poke out of lane and too squishy to be a frontliner where your ult is most useful. Recommended for situations where your team comp has enough tanky frontliners and peel to allow you to focus on damage. The third path, and the one I personally use, is the Protobelt path with Conquer as my main rune, combined with Presence of Mind, Mana Flow Band, and Transcendence. This path trades early mana sustainability for every other stat Swain will need: health, AP, and CDR. The active also gives you a quick dash that can be used to help redirect your E, as well as slowing projectiles that help you stick onto your opponent. The problem with this build is the lack of mana for a majority of the game, and it's a path that requires you to snowball early to make the most of Presence of Mind and Mana Flow Band. This path isn't recommended for those new to Swain or for those who aren't confident in their ability to snowball early. When you add up these flaws, a kit that is easy to counter and doesn't properly synergize, cooldown and wave clear issues, and itemization that always misses an essential stat, you get a champion like Swain. While he is an effective support, it's only because there's another person in the lane to help mitigate his weaknesses, and quite frankly, there's more chance in the lane to land an Eon, even if it's difficult against smart opponents. Swain is unfortunately stuck in a birdcage. Within the cage, Swain is powerless, unable to break free and thrive. But with the help of someone else, he becomes a serious threat. Maybe one day we'll see the Grand General back in a solo lane, and maybe, just maybe, the early bird will gut the worm once more. So now that I've covered pretty much everything about this champion, what do I think needs to change? Well, I've basically already discussed what I would like to see, that being a revert to Q's cooldown ankle, switching the mana regen from his passive back to his Q, and some kind of change to his E. Personally, I think his E should root both ways, but the root duration should be shorter on the way out and longer on its way back in. So that way, at least Swain still has the opportunity to land some other abilities for a quick trade, but if he does get the root on the way back, he has a much bigger reward for landing something that's so much more difficult to land. I think these changes would put Swain back in lanes while keeping him healthy as a support as well. Other changes I've seen suggested are having Souls scale the damage on abilities, have his Q on a short cooldown similar to Nasus ult, and complete kit reworks, which I doubt would happen soon, if at all. But what do you guys think needs to change? Let me know in the comments. Maybe a Riot employee will see this and forward it to the design team. As of this recording, Riot King Cobra has actually spoke about their plans with Swain, or lack thereof at the moment. Regardless, whether or not Swain gets buffed to solo lane viability again or not, I hope this video was both educational and entertaining. Be sure to leave a like if you liked the video and leave a comment on what you thought about it. Thanks for watching.